Alright, welcome back to developing your training philosophy, your training model video series. Welcome back. Yes, so now we're going to dive in to an example of how we actually start developing your training philosophy by using a example that I'm quite, well versed in, the best that I kind of know with regards to training, the one I've done the most research on, and that's hypertrophy, building muscle. Now, this is going to be an example of how I've applied some principles to a particular physical characteristic, which is building muscle, the physiology of building muscle. And I'm going to dive into it. I'm not going to give you any references with regards to scientific papers or anything like that. I'm going to give you information and resources and theory behind why I have developed these scientific, I call them scientific, but I'll call them principles of hypertrophy training. And this is going to be an example of how I've built my philosophy out, and I hope it's some kind of useful and provides some kind of value for you and behind the scenes of that thought process, so you can start then doing the same for your training and your thought process. So with hypertrophy, and when, to be honest, with any physical characteristic, the number one principle is, if you want to do something, you have to do the damn thing. You have to be specific. You're not going to be building muscle to an optimal degree or even at all if you're kind of sedentary, if you're not actually trying to do it, if you're just sitting on your butt all day. Even if you say you want to build muscle, if you're not kind of pursuing the behaviors or the further principles that I will discuss in this video series, you're not going to do it. And that's the same with any kind of thing. And I think that's kind of a universal truth as well. Be it like, you're not going to be able to survive, I'm thinking right off the top of my head here, but any species is not going to be able to survive unless they are reproducing. So if the goal is to reproduce, that's the end target, that's the kind of outcome, the physical real life outcome, you have to be specific with trying to reproduce. So first things first, if you want to build muscle, you have to focus on building muscle. You have to kind of have that in your mind, understand these further principles and apply them in your training. Your behaviors have to be aligned with that. Something I always touch on with any physical characteristic development that you want to do. If you want to lose weight, you have to actually try and lose weight and apply those principles of weight loss, for example. So once you've got that, you're being specific, you're trying to build muscle. Now, what kind of principles would you apply to that process? So for me, the number one most important thing with your training, if you're trying to build muscle, is intensity. Now, this is something that I wasted so much time on, because I used to be deep into YouTube with the Hodge twins, all of that, and they always used to say, this is what I used to hear, you don't have to go to failure to get good results in the gym. And I agreed with that. I was like, yeah, you don't have to. And I was training at a gym at the time, and there was a lot of bodybuilders, and they were like smashing steroids, and I was like, well, the reason why they were getting results is because they're steroids, not because they're going to failure, not because they're training hard. But the more I've learned, the more I've kind of really tried to understand the physiological characteristics of developing muscle. You need to work hard. This is why intensity for me is the overarching number one principle for building muscle, because those last 5 reps away from failure, that proximity to failure, how close you are to failure, is really when you're going to be building the most amount of muscle. And you're kind of stimulating your body, you're telling your body you need to grow. So those last few reps need to be hard. You'll hopefully see that in some of my sets on the screen later in this session, that some of my sets are really hard. You'll see in my face, I'm fucking working. This is week 1 as well, so I'm a few reps in reserve. So you kind of want to be around 5 reps in reserve, but as we talked about in the first video, you want to be cyclical. So not every session needs to be to failure, not every set needs to be to failure, but some sets, some weeks need to be to failure. So this is the first in a working week program. and I'm about 3 to 4 to 5 reps away from failure, still in that range of 5 reps to failure, because I still want to stimulate my muscles, but I want to save those really stimulative sets for those final weeks. So week 3 or week 4 of this program, I will have every set to failure, and it will be brutal training, and that's really how you're going to develop muscle. And the kind of mechanisms, the thought process behind that is there's a lot of evidence suggesting that mechanical tension within your muscle is the biggest leading indicator of developing that muscle. And you can think of mechanical tension as the pulling forces in that muscle. So the pulling forces within that muscle is your mechanical tension. And to create maximal forces, you need to recruit the most amount of fibers within that muscle. And that tends to be when you are close to failure, because to move a weight that is at the limit of your abilities, you will need to recruit more muscle fibers to do that. And that might mean some are kind of tired out. On the first few reps, for example, you might not need that many muscle fibers because you can manage it with less. But as those get fatigued, you're going to recruit more and more muscle fibers in order to produce that force to move that weight, to move that resistance. And therefore, within that muscle, you will create a greater amount of tension or pulling force, which will be telling your body, hey, bitch, I gotta grow. I want to develop some more muscle cells. So intensity, overarching principle for hypertrophy, it's number one. Every set that you're in the gym, you've got to put in the work. You've got to get within those 5 reps away from failure. This is fundamental if you want to have really good results. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to do loads of sets. Loads of people go into the gym and do a bunch of sets, 30 sets plus per body part even sometimes. And the thing is, most of those sets are ineffective. You're just tiring yourself out, but you're not causing a stimulus because you're not recruiting enough muscle fibers and you're not producing enough force within those muscle tissues to enable you to stimulate a response from your body to tell it, I need to build muscle. So this is what an effective set is. It's also an easier way, I'm going to talk about volume more in the next video, but it's an easier way to count your sets. So when you're training and you're in a set, you can think about this force velocity curve. So force being the amount of muscle, the amount of energy used per muscle fiber to produce a force within that cell. And velocity you can think of as the speed at which you're kind of moving over time. Acceleration is another kind of similar thought process, but the greater force you're producing, the slower you'll be moving. So if you get closer to failure, your reps should slow down, and that effectively means you're producing more force. So when you're doing more powerful movements, you're not producing as much total force within that muscle, creating that mechanical tension, as you would be when you're getting closer to failure on those really slow controlled reps where you're recruiting the most amount of fibers and therefore stimulating that muscle more. So as your speed of your reps goes down, your force goes up. So that's why your last few reps should be a shaky, grunty, very hard set. And this will kind of differ depending on your makeup quite a lot. If you're more fast twitch, if you're more slow twitch, in regards to the proportions of muscle fibers within each individual muscle, that will kind of dictate how slow your reps will be. So for me, for example, I'm pretty good at everything endurance wise. I don't have to train hard. I've run a marathon, you can see on my YouTube. I didn't really train for that. I'm good at these endurance events. Whereas with resistance training, I've never really had amazing results until I kind of applied these principles, because I didn't think I need to train to failure. And therefore I think I'm more slow twitch. And therefore if you look at some of my training videos, as I go on, I'll pop out more and you'll see this. My last few reps can look painfully slow, and they are painful. And that's because I think I'm more predominantly slow twitch in a lot of my muscle tissues. It's just a guess, But if I look at athletes that are naturally more strong, people that can go in and back squat body weight, 2x body weight, 3x body weight, whatever, within a few months of training, they might be more fast twitch predominantly, and their top, those reps in close proximity to failure, close to failure, might still be quite fast because they're more fast twitch and they're able to produce more force at those higher velocities, and they never really slow down. So that's going to be kind of differences between individuals, but the reps should be relatively slower towards the closer you get to failure. So that's a good way you can judge the intensity. So they did this study with people who were quite advanced trainers, and they asked them, all right, do a 10 rep max on a bench press, guess what your 10 reps max would be, and then they kind of chose a weight, tested it, and then they asked them to do the same set, I think a week later or something, or another day, and do as many reps as possible. And I believe the average across those sets, so they tried to get a 10 rep max, and the average was like 5 to 10 reps off. They were that far away from failure. It's quite hard to judge how close you are to failure, and therefore it's good sometimes to go all the way to failure just to kind of see what you're really capable of, and you need to get yourself mentally psyched up, and it's a skill to push that hard. So you kind of develop that skill to be able to apply that intensity over time. Make sure you've got someone there just in case. And I wouldn't do this on things like back squats or deadlifts. Easier to do this on something like a machine where you've got maximum stability around you, or something with dumbbells where you can just fucking drop it if it gets too intense. But you got to test yourself. You got to test that ability with regards to intensity. So I can't say this enough. Intensity is the foundational principle for building muscle in the gym. You've got to put in that work. You've got to make your sets hard. Do fewer sets that are tougher. You'll get way better results. Yeah, I hope you got some value from this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that kind of you got the idea of where this model philosophy of training is going, with the example of how we're going now into hypertrophy, looking at the principles for hypertrophy and how I'm developing those moving forward. Next video will be on volume with regards to hypertrophy training and the principles around that. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you have a great day. Goodbye.